Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. Let me walk you through something that will probably feel familiar. You are in a test or a course or a pattern, and things are going reasonably well. Not perfectly, but well enough. And then one thing goes slightly wrong. A transition that was a little braced, a distance you did not quite get right, a movement that felt like a rough draft of what you produced in Thursday's lesson. It is small, it is recoverable, and there is no real damage done, except something shifts anyway. The next movement is tighter, more managed. You are already compensating for a problem that has not materialized yet. Your horse has changed underneath you, not dramatically, just slightly quicker in his mouth, slightly less through his back, a fraction less generous in his impulsion. And then the second mistake arrives, and then the third, and by the fourth, something has stopped feeling like a bad patch and started feeling like evidence of something. You are not sure what exactly, but it does not feel good. Think back to the last time your ride started slipping like that, and notice where your focus began to narrow. Did it pull backward toward what just happened, or did it scatter forward into anticipation of the next mistake? Most riders, if they are honest, will say both, and that split attention is not a weakness. It is a clue about what is actually happening in the brain, which is what we are going to trace today in full. Most riders experience this sequence and describe it as falling apart, as if something structurally collapsed under the pressure. What it actually is, mechanically and neurologically, and circuit by circuit, is something far more specific than that. Specific things, unlike collapses, can be interrupted. Understanding the structure of what is actually happening is the first and most necessary step toward finding those interruption points. Here is what is actually happening when the unraveling begins. Your brain has a structure called the anterior cingulate cortex. Think of it as your internal performance monitor, running continuously in the background, comparing what you intended to happen with what actually happened, and generating a signal the moment those two things diverge. Researchers call this signal the error-related negativity, and the timing is remarkable. It fires within approximately 100 milliseconds of a mistake. That is before you have consciously registered what went wrong, before you have decided whether it matters, before you have had a single intentional thought about the situation. It fires automatically, involuntarily, without asking for your permission. Under ordinary conditions, moderate arousal, manageable pressure, adequate recovery, that signal does something genuinely useful. It triggers a brief orienting response, recalibrates attention, and sets the system up to execute the next attempt better. The error is detected, processed adaptively, and the adjustment happens. That is actually how skill improvement works. But under the specific conditions of competition, elevated cortisol, a sensitized amygdala, sympathetic dominance already building from the stakes of the day, that same signal does not travel into a regulatory circuit. It travels into an amplifying one. The anterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala are densely, bidirectionally connected structures. In a well-regulated nervous system, their relationship is roughly stabilizing. The amygdala signals potential threat and generates arousal, while the prefrontal portions of the anterior cingulate dampen that signal once it has been processed, preventing it from flooding the rest of the system. Under elevated cortisol, that dampening relationship degrades, the prefrontal brake loosens, and the error, which was just an error, a single moment of imprecision, gets processed as a threat to something larger. The threat then generates more sympathetic arousal. More arousal produces more cortisol, and more cortisol further degrades the prefrontal limbic connection that would allow the system to regulate itself back down. The rider, now deeper in sympathetic dominance than she was before the mistake occurred, is less equipped to execute the next movement well, which makes the next mistake more likely, which the amygdala registers as further confirmation that something is genuinely wrong. That is not falling apart. That is a feedback loop, a measurable, documented neurological feedback loop. And once you see it that way, the question changes from why does this keep happening to me to where exactly are the interruption points? That is the core biology. Now, here is what compounds it. There are at least two mechanisms that deepen the loop once it starts, and both of them matter for understanding why the conventional advice, concentrate more, try harder, just focus, does not work. The first is what researchers call error induced attentional tunneling. Immediately after a mistake, the brain's orienting response temporarily pulls processing resources toward what just went wrong, and under normal circumstances, with a pause long enough for that orienting phase to complete, this is adaptive. The system is gathering information before the next attempt. The problem is that in competition, the next demand arrives immediately. The horse is already at the next fence, the test has already moved to the next movement, and the orienting response triggered by the first mistake is still active when the second movement begins. The sensory processing that allows the rider to genuinely feel the horse, to receive the information being transmitted through the contact and the seat, is compromised by an orienting response that has not yet finished with what happened 30 seconds ago. Your attention is stuck at the scene of an accident while the road ahead requires everything you have. Pause here for a moment and consider what that means practically. The feeling of being unable to let go of a mistake mid-round, of your mind pulling backward when you need it forward, is not a concentration failure. It is the neurological cost of an incomplete adjustment cycle running out of time. The second mechanism is stress-induced perseveration, which is the tendency under elevated cortisol to repeat ineffective responses rather than shifting flexibly to a different approach. The prefrontal systems responsible for recognizing that something is not working and generating an alternative are among the first cognitive resources to degrade under stress, which means the stressed rider does not simply fail to correct the mistake, she maintains the conditions that produced it because the neurological machinery for flexible revision has been partially taken offline by the same stress response driving the cascade. This is why telling someone in the middle of a cascade to try harder or concentrate more is not just unhelpful, it is asking her to access the exact resource that stress has most specifically compromised. The instruction demands more of the thing that is most depleted, and the loop tightens rather than opens. That is the biology of why the cascade multiplies. Now, here is where it gets particularly important for equestrians, because your horse is not a bystander in any of this. He is an active participant in the cascade, and the mechanism that makes him so is the same mechanism that makes the partnership beautiful when it is functioning well. Research on physiological coupling between horse and rider shows that in an established partnership, each partner's autonomic state influences the other through the physical interface of riding, the seat, the contact, the respiratory rhythm, the micro tensions transmitted through the rider's body at every stride. This coupling is why a truly skilled, regulated rider can settle a tense horse through the quality of her physical presence alone before any deliberate correction has been made. In a cascade, the same mechanism runs in precisely the opposite direction. The rider's escalating dysregulation transmits to the horse through every point of contact, and the horse, receiving a progressively more tense and reactive rider, becomes tighter and less generous in response. The rider then experiences that change in the horse as an additional threat signal, confirmation that things are deteriorating, which activates the amygdala further, increases cortisol further, and deepens the cascade further. The horse is not making things harder. He is faithfully reflecting a nervous system state that he has been receiving through the reins and the seat since the first mistake occurred. Research on horse rider physiological synchrony also suggests that familiar, well-trained partnerships show stronger bidirectional coupling, meaning the influence each partner has on the other's state is actually greater when they know each other well, which means the horse that knows you, the one you have ridden hundreds of times, the one whose rhythms and responses are woven into your muscle memory, can feel your escalation more precisely than a stranger horse would. The partnership that is your greatest asset in a good round becomes, inside a cascade, a more efficient amplifier of your dysregulation. Think about what that means for the horse you love most, the one you know best. In a cascade, that depth of knowing runs in both directions. That is not a reason to despair. It is a reason to understand the mechanism clearly enough to interrupt it early, before the amplification has time to compound. So, where are the interruption points and what does the research actually support? The first is time, and specifically how the rider uses the natural pauses that exist within every competitive performance. The post error adjustment cycle, the process through which the brain recalibrates after a mistake, needs a window to complete before the next demand arrives. In competition, that window exists in places riders often underuse or actively fill with self criticism. The breath between movements, the rising trot down the long side, the walk across the diagonal, the stride before the corner. Riders who have developed the deliberate habit of using these moments to consciously return attention forward, rather than replaying what just happened, are doing something neurologically real. They are giving the adjustment cycle time to complete before the next movement begins, and that timing is not metaphorical. It reflects the actual duration requirements of a biological process. The second interruption point is the process cue, and this one requires preparation before the test begins, when the prefrontal cortex is still fully online. Research on how the brain resumes tasks after interruptions shows that concrete, specific, approach oriented attentional targets significantly reduce the period of degraded performance that follows a disruption. Abstract instructions have no traction in this context. Recover, don't do that again, just concentrate are not process cues. They have no specific content for the attentional system to engage with. What works is something like forward and straight to the corner marker or outside shoulder into the turn, specific, future oriented, decided in advance. Because in the middle of a cascade, you are not going to generate a good strategy on the fly. The prefrontal flexibility that requires has already been partially compromised by the stress response. What you can do is activate a strategy that was already built in calmer conditions, and that activation is genuinely accessible even when the system is under load. The third interruption point is the exhale, not as a generic calming technique, but as a specific physiological tool with a dual function that matters particularly for riders. A slow, deliberate exhale directly activates the vagus nerve's cardiac influence, shifts the autonomic balance incrementally toward parasympathetic activity, and creates a brief window in which the amygdala's threat escalation is reduced. And because the quality of the seat and the mobility of the hip are directly coupled to whether the rider is holding or releasing breath, that same exhale is simultaneously a horsemanship correction. The deliberate breath out after a mistake addresses the nervous system and the physical communication with the horse in a single action. And that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means something that feels like a mental strategy is also changing what the horse feels underneath you. One action, two effects, both of them working in the direction you need. There is a fourth factor that shapes how interruptible the cascade is, and it has nothing to do with what happens during the performance. It has to do with the state of the system before the first mistake ever occurs. Research on stress induced perseveration shows that chronic stress gradually depletes the prefrontal resources most involved in flexible error recovery, the same resources that cascade interruption requires in the moment. A rider who arrives at a competition already carrying substantial accumulated stress from a demanding professional life, inadequate sleep, and the cognitive load of managing a full life alongside serious equestrian training has less regulatory reserve before the cascade even begins. The window for easy interruption is narrower from the start. Managing the broader stress load in the weeks before competition is therefore not a lifestyle recommendation. It is a performance variable with a specific neurological basis, because the system that protects you from the cascade is the same system that chronic stress progressively erodes. And there is something worth saying about training because the cascade can be rehearsed, not by training for errorless performance, but by deliberately practicing recovery. Encountering a mistake under mild pressure, applying the interruption tools, and experiencing the return to functional riding builds a neural pathway for exactly that sequence. The rider who has rehearsed interruption in training has a more accessible version of it available in competition. The prefrontal systems involved in flexible recovery are stronger for having been exercised under manageable pressure, and the amygdala's response to error has been partially habituated. The threat appraisal that launches the cascade has encountered enough previous errors that did not become disasters that its prediction of catastrophe is slightly less automatic. The training environment shapes this too, in ways that accumulate slowly over years of lessons. A training culture that treats mistakes primarily as urgent problems requiring immediate correction, where lessons stop, back up, and recorrect after every error, builds the threat appraisal circuit configuration. Every urgent correction delivers an implicit message. That error was serious enough to halt forward movement, serious enough to require immediate remediation. Over months and years, that message calibrates the amygdala's future response to similar errors. A training culture that treats mistakes as information, that corrects with specificity and without alarm, that maintains the momentum of forward riding while addressing what went wrong, builds something neurologically different. It trains adaptive error processing rather than threat escalation, and the rider who has trained in that environment arrives at competition with a different relationship between error detection and threat response than the one who has not. The cascade that runs to its conclusion feels like a structural failure, like something inside the performance broke under the weight of the day. It has momentum, it has physics, it feeds on itself in ways that feel increasingly beyond influence. But it began as a single mistake in a system that had the equipment to process it adaptively, and for a combination of specific, traceable neurological reasons, that equipment was not available in that moment. The cascade interrupted at the first signal. With the deliberate exhale, the prepared process cue, the attention returned consciously forward during the natural pause before the next movement is just a mistake. One mistake recalibrated and left behind while the performance continues. That is the difference. Not talent, not nerve, not the mysterious composure that some riders seem to possess and others seem permanently unable to access. The timing of the exhale, the specificity of the process cue, the regulatory reserve the system carried into the day. Specific things applied early that change the entire trajectory of what follows. And that, more than any secret of talent or luck, is how composure is actually built. One deliberate breath, one forward thought, one recovered stride at a time. Everything I have talked about today is drawn from the research in my new book, The Amateur's Edge, The Psychology of the Amateur Equestrian Brain, available now on Amazon. The link is in the show notes. The book covers this cascade mechanism in full, alongside every other major psychological factor that shapes how amateur riders experience performance, and how that experience can genuinely change with the right preparation. Not theory, not motivation, not the usual advice to breathe and believe in yourself. The actual mechanisms explained clearly with what to do about them. You have unraveled in a test before. Now you know exactly why, and more importantly, you know where the interruption points are, and that they were always closer than they felt. I am Esther Adams. This is Strides to Solutions.